what did everybody think of that first 4 minutes? I can tell you that Terry O'Quinn is someone I'm absolutely not supposed to talk about, so that you should feel very special that you got to see some of that. That's very exciting stuff. Again, we're going to dig into some stuff. I hope at the end of this we're going to have some time for some audience questions, so start thinking about those as they go. But first, let me bring up our co-creators, developers, Sam Shaw. And, of course, Dustin Thomason.
Hiya.
Welcome to Austin, guys.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here.
So to start off with, I mean, I feel like this is a unique project from a lot of different perspectives. But to me, I mean, usually TV shows come about from either an original idea or a straight adaptation or a slightly altered adaptation of an existing property. And this is kind of a combination of both. So how did you guys get started down the road for Castle Rock?
Yeah, our process is kind of confounding. Do you not have a microphone? Are you gonna? Do you want to lean in and we'll be like the Mandrell sisters or whatever?
You can pass.
No, it's fine. It's fine. We're still friends even after this year. So what the question was the sort of genesis of it. So Dustin and I are old friends. We worked together in different capacities for a long time, and batted around lots of ideas for shows and projects, most of which are completely disastrous. But we realized recently, like 10 years ago, we were exchanging a bunch of emails, and there was this chain of emails about the idea of writing a show set in kind of like a generic off-brand Castle Rock in a way. Like we're both reformed fiction writers, and we're fans of Stephen King as kids and love those books. And in particular, like we're fans of like geography in Stephen King because there's a really strong sense of place. And I love having spent time in Maine, which is like a supremely strange and unsettling place to spend time. I went to summer camp there for many years, so like my experience of being terrorized as a child, I associate with the landscape of Maine. So, I loved and Dusty loved the idea that Stephen King kind of returns to the scene of the crime and has visited like decades and centuries of nightmares on the same, however many acres of land in Maine, and you wonder like who the fuck stays in a town after like the second serial killer and the demonic truck and the rabid dog and etc. And I also loved H.P. Lovecraft, who writes about Arkham, Massachusetts. So the sort of the idea of what is a town that's been visited by more than its share of nightmares. And so we found this email that was sort of like, wouldn't it be great we'd do a show? Obviously, we could never set a show in Castle Rock because we'd never get the keys to that castle. But we'd do our own, it would be like, Citadel Rock, or whatever. Anyway, and then in a very roundabout way, about a year and a half ago, we had the chance to sit down with the head of TV at Bad Robot and Ben Stevenson and had some conversations with him about Castle Rock. And J.J. Abrams is a huge Stephen King super fan, and so it just it sort of opened up the possibility of doing this show, and yeah. Now you say something.
Okay. Hi everyone. Yeah, I mean I think that for us in particular, in thinking about the show, having sort of done over decades a kind of I think relatively comprehensive read and watch of Stephen King, it felt to us like there was a really interesting way to approach the material, which was to say what is a town like Castle Rock like now, and what a place that has been beaten up by time and by economic pressures and by all of the things that small towns in America have been beaten up by. I think we were excited by the idea of kind of coming back to this place that had haunted our childhood dreams and thinking about what it would look like in the modern era.
Well, I mean, not to get too technical, but were there difficulties in getting kind of the rights to do this? Like you touched on it a little bit, but the idea that there's so many King properties involved in the show, I mean, was that kind of a big challenge?
I mean, it in a way, I think, goes to the thing Sam said a second ago, which is like the idea 10 years ago of being able to actually do this seemed impossible to us as young writers, and I think that this is where, at some level, JJ becomes kind of the ingredient without which any of this is possible, because JJ not only has a very strong relationship with Stephen King, but also works with Warner Brothers, and we've had a great relationship with Warner Brothers, obviously with Hulu as well, and Warner Brothers was the studio behind so many of the biggest and most sort of iconic King films, and so there was really no other way, honestly, to do it. We wouldn't have been able to do it without, and we've been thrilled to do it with, but without access to all of that material and to be able to sort of tap into that larger King universe.
When in the process did you actually meet with Stephen? Like, when did you actually get to kind of talk to him, and did you run the ideas by him before they were scripts? Did you talk to him about the idea when it was, percolating? Like, how did that go?
Steve was sort of for us like Charlie and Charlie's Angels. So he was more like the kind of like crucial figure who loomed large from afar. I mean, I think my understanding is, I definitely wouldn't speak for him, but my understanding is that, like, I think there was a time in his career where he was like sort of into kind of the Hollywood scene, and he directed Maximum Overdrive and was sort of interested in having a hand in the afterlife of his works and adaptations. I think now he's just so focused on doing his own work and at his own amazing and insanely prolific clip. So there were early conversations that were just about getting his sanction and blessing, because the truth is, like, even if Warner Brothers controlling the rights had said, great, go ahead, Castle Rock is an important town in the Stephen King library. It clearly is important to him, and so it was really crucial to. I mean, we needed and wanted to have his blessing, and so we were really gratified when he said yes. In part because our understanding was that, like, we were not the first people who had knocked on his door asking for a cup of sugar and to please be able to set a TV show in Castle Rock, and I think probably it's just the strength of his relationship with JJ that made that possible. And so otherwise, we sent him all the scripts and that sort of thing, and there were places where we the story of this season. So the show is a kind of a seasonal anthology show. So this season is a 10-episode season. It's one 10-episode story, and there are sort of tributaries along the way and different points of view, but there's essentially one story that runs its course throughout these episodes. And there are some Stephen King characters who are really important to the story, and then there are a lot of original characters who kind of share some DNA with characters from Stephen King classics. But there'd be moments where we would want to do something unorthodox with one of his characters, and so we'd have to sort of make the call and on bended knee ask him if he was cool with it. And he was always really, really he was great and flexible and gave us great license. So it was about as cool as you sort of go into an experience like that hoping that Stephen King is going to be cool, and it turns out that he's really cool.
And actually, after he watched the first episode, we were really excited because he said that for the first time in a very long time, he actually sort of called out to his TV and told someone to not go where they were starting to go. And that was very exciting for us to actually be able to get Stephen King to yell at his TV.
Yeah. Since he's basically made a career out of sending people into places that they should not go, so it was good. It was cool.
So what was the research process like? Like, once you've got the blessing and you're able to kind of use a lot of the stuff that's really there. I mean, what did you guys go through? Did you just reread everything? Did you re-watch all the movies?
Yeah, you nerd out, man.
Okay,
That's
great.
what you got to do. Yeah, I mean, part of what was cool was, so we had a writer's room as most shows do, and it sort of became like a postgraduate Stephen King seminar. There were the kind of like Mount Rushmore of Stephen King novels and adaptations that we're all really familiar with. But then there was stuff that we hadn't returned to in a long time, and it would not have been humanly possible for us to sit down and read every page. And so we sort of divided and conquered and spent a lot of time talking about the stories and watching movies and trying to figure out what made them tick. And part of the approach to the show was sort of to adapt Stephen King as a genre almost more than to adapt a single work. And so that involved a lot of discussion on our part about what are the what are the kind of common tropes and ideas and story structures, and what makes a Stephen King story a Stephen King story, which is kind of a fun exercise.
Yeah, and I think too, when we sort of put together our writers' room, it was important to us to actually have a range of people's familiarity with King, because I think that ultimately, obviously, we really hope that this is a show that appeals to the Stephen King fans, but at the same time, we wanted to make a show that would actually appeal to everyone, that even people who only knew Stephen King a little bit or thought they knew a little bit about what Stephen King represents would sort of be brought into this amazing world that we've been living in for a very long time as readers. And so I think for us, it was really interesting to sort of start. I think we probably started with the most Stephen King knowledge of anyone in the writers' room, but to have a range of people who were sort of being introduced to Stephen King in the same way that an audience would be introduced to Stephen King, and so sort of run the gamut, I think allowed us to tap into some of the different aspects of King.
Well, I mean, to that end, how do you kind of set the boundaries for yourselves in terms of like Easter eggs? Like a lot of people really love watching these kind of TV shows and mysteries in general to discover, little hidden things within the frame and little kind of references that are tossed aside. And obviously you've got, a plethora of opportunities to do that with all of this King background. How do you kind of balance that in terms of writing every episode?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if anybody has seen, I don't know if you guys have ever seen, there's a map of the Stephen King universe, like a visual map of it, and we had it hanging in our writers' room. Like it's mind-blowing in terms of the way that he's been connecting his stories basically for 40 years, and that was really also a kind of exciting part for us, was to be able to start to tap into some of the universe that he'd really been creating for a long time, even in sort of askance ways. So I think when it came to Easter eggs, I think that it's always a careful balance is the truth, because we've all seen things that sort of are so packed full with Easter eggs that it starts to become a little dizzying. And so I think for us, it felt important to, when we were picking King characters, when we were using King stories and locations, to make sure that they all had meaning and they were sort of being done in service of the story and not just sort of dropped in service of a little thrill of seeing, Cujo running by in a frame or whatever.
Yeah, no, I agree with
I
that. I
got
agree.
it. All right,
No,
good.
but I will say, with that said, like, there also, there's definitely some like PhD level kind of deep cut, like at times one of us would show a script to the other and would be like, but did you get that thing that piece of set dressing in the background is a reference to the epigraph of The Stand or whatever? And be like, you fucking loser, And so, like,
I was the one writing that, and he was the one calling me the loser.
That's always the case. That's always the case. And so there's that too. I mean, sort of the impulse was like to try to write a show that that can be fun and pleasurable for somebody who has no experience reading Stephen King, but also to like satiate people who want to nerd out like we might as well.
Well, what about finding the locations? I mean, even just in the clip that we got to see, there's like so many kind of just iconic imagery being flashed, and it really sets a tone in and of itself, and I feel like, the early episodes really do that very, very well, especially in terms of the setting and in terms of kind of what looks like, on location that you found. So what was that process like?
Well, it was really, really important. It's funny, like, I hadn't really thought about it in this way, but like casting the town of Castle Rock was almost like the sort of like crucial casting search of the process in a way, because like we knew this was not a show that we could shoot on stages for the most part. We did have stages, but a huge amount of the work was location work, and that's sort of true. Like the last show that I created that we worked on together, Manhattan, was about the atomic bomb in Los Alamos, and like we shot it all on location. And you could feel there was dust in the air and texture, and outside the windows there were military trucks driving by, and that was like really, really important to just the vibe of the show and the aesthetic of the show. And so that felt important to us too. So we did a bunch of scouting around, and we drove to Canada because there are obviously there are a lot of economic reasons why it's really advantageous to shoot up there. We drove around New England. We spent time in Maine. We would have loved to shoot in Maine. It's really hard to do that because there's not really much crew base and there aren't really tax incentives to support it. But we wound up we saw a lot of great little towns in Massachusetts, and we wound up shooting in a town called Orange, Massachusetts. Was it? Does someone know Orange? No. Anyway, and it's a little bit of a weird thing, like, to go and pay somebody a visit and be like, excuse me, could we borrow your town and have it stand in for the worst place on earth? It's like it's sort of an awkward conversation to have. And it's a town that there's something really beautiful about its state of disrepair. And we went and saw it in winter, and all the trees were barren, and it looked incredibly haunted in its way, and industry has fled, and so they're the old kind of abandoned mill buildings. And then we started shooting in July, and when we returned, like, the trees were in full bloom. We were like, it's gorgeous here. Like, what are we gonna do? What are we gonna do? But yeah, finding that town and being able to shoot there. In some ways, it was quite inconvenient. So I think we were like the first drama to shoot in scripted drama, TV drama in Massachusetts since like Spencer for Hire, like 27 years ago or whatever it was. Which was great because there are fantastic crews in Massachusetts. It was really cool to be there. But we had stages, and then this town was, whatever it was, an hour away from our stages. And so, which may not sound like that much of a hassle, but when you're shooting until 3 in the morning and your crew has to drive back, you guys may know that, like, that's a real problem in our business is crew safety and late hours and that sort of thing. And so at times it was really challenging, but I think it paid dividends because the town really has its own kind of voice in the show in a way.
Yeah, and I think too, the town itself was so incredibly supportive of the process, and I think they were excited for the idea of, I actually think that once they got over the idea that they might be doubling for the worst place on earth, they were really excited about having us there, and we're so supportive. And it was amazing in that same way as Sam said about Manhattan, like, we were really able to shut the town down at some level for periods, and to be able to shoot practically in their churches and in their stores and on their main street, and like to really be able to, which is again sounds small in some ways, but being able to control all of that when you have this massive production coming in is really important. And they could not have been more welcoming to us and letting us do pretty much whatever we wanted, which sometimes was in a J.J. Abrams, Stephen King production, pretty crazy, as you might imagine.
Well, you kind of already answered my next question, which is actually about the human casting of the show, and I was curious, like, kind of who was the crucial element of it. But I also just want to say, you guys assembled just an all-star roster of like supporting TV talent that everybody wants to see more of. I mean, from Andre to Melanie Linsky to, it's incredible. But kind of for this first season, who was kind of the key for you guys to get in place?
Well, so the story really centers around Henry Deaver, Andre Holland's character, and so I think for us, and he's really the way into the story, and so for us, that was certainly the sort of place we needed to start, which was to find someone who we felt could not only carry the big load of this show on their shoulders, but also, I think this is something we talk a lot about, and it's true sort of from Andre and then throughout the rest of the cast, which is that, one of the challenges of a genre show is inevitably that you end up with characters who sort of understand at some level that they're in a genre story, and that's it's a weird intangible, but it's like what we wanted to do when we assembled our cast, and Andre was, I think, really the first step of that puzzle, was to find actors who really brought you into a world and made it feel totally true and human and natural, even as strange occurrences started to happen around them. And so that was kind of the beginning, and Andre was always our first choice for the role, and so it was a great place to start, and then it kind of expanded from there.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, you say these are like actors you want to see more of. I mean, I had a writing teacher once who said that that he didn't consider himself a writer as much as like a reader moved to emulation, and we are definitely that way as TV writers. Like we love TV. Every once in a while, you meet people who work in TV who are like, oh no, I never watch television, which I find super confusing. You know what I mean? So, but largely it was like, how can you watch togetherness and not have your experience be to be like, who is this creature? Like, who is, like Melanie Linsky is a genius, you know what I mean? And so to take those people and bring them into a world and a genre and a space that may not be the space that we naturally associate with them seemed really exciting. And we did that at other levels too. Like, our first couple of episodes, and then the fourth episode are all directed by Mike Uppendahl, who's also our producing director. And Mike's done a ton of stuff that I'm sure people in here have watched and loved. But like, I first got to know him as a director of Mad Men, and he directed some of the like most beloved episodes of Mad Men, and he's done other Legion and other stuff too. But it seemed really interesting to what would it be to do a show that is a sort of psychological horror show or a genre show or has elements of sort of uncanny mystery to it, but that has the eye of somebody like Mike, who can also frame and tell a story that's about Peggy and Don Draper. It seemed like an interesting way of approaching the material.
Well, what about Bill Skarsgård? I mean, obviously, he's blown up now that it has become the phenomenon that it was. But did you know anything about that?
He's like a beetle. We've seen.
Yeah.
We're in New York Comic Con, and there were people chasing him down the street. It was crazy.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah, sorry.
But yeah, did you know anything about that casting when he was cast in this? Like, did you know there was going to be a Stephen King tie-in again for that actor when?
Yeah, we did. What we, of course, none of us had any idea was that it was going to become the phenomenon that it did. I mean, I think it was interesting, and obviously there's sort of the two sides of the Stephen King casting coin in this show are Bill Skarsgård and Sissy Spacek, and so it's like Sissy, who is sort of is the original Stephen King character in some ways, and Bill, who's sort of star, and Bill, who's sort of the most recent Stephen King star. With regard to Bill, we, in fact, when he first came in, and we felt that the role was really perfect for him, and had known him from Hemlock Grove and from some other work of his, and not it, and we hadn't seen the movie. And it was about, I think, maybe 6 months actually before the movie even came out. And so I actually, in a weird way, I think there was more hesitation about it than an initial attempt to embrace it on both sides, which is to say we really wanted him, and I think he really liked the scripts, but he was a little reluctant to jump right back into a Stephen King universe, and we were a little reluctant because we weren't sure exactly what that would mean and what it would say, and ultimately I think we made the decision. I know we made the decision based on just, okay, in the end, you just have to take the best actor who's the most right for the part, and that ultimately whatever work they did before that, obviously we all love actors for their prior work, and we become excited about them in certain characters, but at the same time, at the end of the day, they're tremendous performers, and that was, I think, for certainly in Bill's case, that was kind of how it played out.
I'm just going to ask this as vaguely as I can because I want to make sure I'm allowed to talk about it. Am I allowed to talk about who Melanie Lynskey's sister, who plays her, because that bit of casting was just such a perfect. I wish there was a documentary that was made
Sure.
of them meeting and being on set, and I was so excited as soon as the pairing happened.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a great story in some ways too, which is that Allison Tolman, who you guys probably know from Fargo.
That was the proper reaction.
There was a gasp. I know.
Yes,
I can't
good.
wait to tell
Very
her. It was actually kind of an amazing story because when Melanie was cast, there was a casting announcement on Deadline or Variety or whatever, and Allison saw the announcement and tweeted at Melanie, and they did not know each other. And she tweeted at or sort of, a mutual admiration society from afar. And she tweeted at Melanie. She said, if there's she said, amazing. And then she said, I'd love to play your sister. Okay. But the weird thing is, like, we knew that the character had a sister. And of course, Allison would have been someone that we would have strongly considered. But as soon as she said that, we were like, wait, Allison Tolman would be the perfect sister. Yeah. So Twitter.
It actually was like a little creepy because we just written the scene, so we were like, what the fuck is going on? Yeah, it was a little like there's like an Alexa on the table or whatever, and Allison Tolman is like participating in the. But yeah, so she like her gag tweet, we were basically like, no, you must now contractually do that and be her sister, and she came and did it, and they're yeah. Watching those guys together is really, really fun.
Yeah, I think everybody's going to be pretty excited about it. And then the last piece of casting kind of character question I had was just about the critical role of Sheriff or former Sheriff Allen. Obviously Scott Glenn is Scott Glenn. He's been around for ages, and that's so exciting that he's going to be part of the series. But This is a character that's existed, on screen a couple of times before with a couple of different actors, and he's an integral role for the Castle Rock, mythology. Kind of just a little bit about what went into, how you wanted to craft him for the show, and then how you decided on Scott Glenn.
Well, I think first, the role of Sheriff Pangborn, who, kind of in Castle Rock, along with Sheriff Bannerman, those are sort of the two pillars of the community in the Castle Rock books. And so I think when we first started talking about this first season and thinking about, well, who do we want to kind of occupy the soul and history of the town, Pangborn felt like the right choice to us. But we're really interested in seeing kind of what, in the books, Pangborn is in his 40s and has had a complicated sort of loss of his family, but we wanted to see, just like the town in a way, what does it look like, sort of 30 years later? What does a guy like that look like as a lion in winter? And I think once we started sort of imagining that, Scott Glenn's voice sort of started creeping into our dreams, because Scott just has, there's something. Scott, I actually think Scott is a deputy sheriff in Idaho, and I think so he's really the real deal in a way, and obviously we've all loved him, from The Hunt for Red October to The Leftovers to and so we've seen him in all these different kinds of roles, but I think for us it just sort of felt like there was really no one else to play the sort of the sheriff of this town, and somebody who had kind of its history written all over him and holding its secrets deep inside him.
Yeah, it was also cool because his character, besides being a sort of, the sort of No Country for Old Men kind of elder statesman, the sort of gunslinger who's hung up his guns kind of figure within the town. He's also the love interest for Sissy's character. Sissy Spacek plays the adoptive mother of Andre Holland's character. And those guys, they've known each other for a long time. They had incredible chemistry. It was just really like this huge joy to watch them play scenes together. In fact, they did a movie, I can't remember, it was in like 1982 or 1983, The River, that they're in together. And so periodically, just like, because it was so surreal, I'd just go to YouTube and watch the trailer for this, like, here's like, here are Sissy and Scott in their, 30s or 40s or whatever it is. Anyway, it was really, really cool to be able to put the two of them together.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about secrets and kind of just how you approach them as showrunners, as filmmakers. Because in TV these days, we're hearing stories about Game of Thrones where they'll deliver scripts to actors and then they self-destruct, like they erase after a few minutes after they've read it or whatever. And people are locking things down. Some creators don't want to share an entire episode with their actors. They only share like the very exact things they have to do. Did you worry about this kind of stuff in terms of leaks, in terms of stuff getting out? How do you approach it?
Well, it actually first reminds me quickly of kind of an amazing moment when Terry O'Quinn actually ended up shooting with us on both our first day of shooting and the last day of shooting. And I remember on the first day of shooting, he had a kind of complicated thing that he had to play, and our great and he had read the script, but he hadn't read all the scripts yet. And our director, Mike Uppendahl, sort of saw him on set and said, well, how much do you want to know about sort of what this means? And Terry said, oh, I'm good, I'm all set. And Mike was like, what you don't want to know anything? And he's like, you work long enough on a J.J. Abrams show and you learn to work on a need-to-know basis. And so it just was very sort of funny to somebody who had been kind of indoctrinated into the Bad Robot cult. And in terms of at the broader level, I think Bad Robot is certainly known for their secrecy, and by the way, with good reason, because obviously there have been a lot of especially technology-related challenges to material being stolen. But I think that our approach in terms of the actors, in terms of our partners, it has always been to sort of to share what they would like to know, and in Terry O'Quinn's case, that was nothing apparently. But to share with them what it is they want, because I think there are certainly some actors who want to know everything from the beginning, and then there are some who don't want to know more than what their character actually knows, and so they want to be able to bring a kind of honest journey to the story rather than knowing exactly, being able to play the end at the beginning.
Yeah, I guess the only there are some kind of protocols that are just they're kind of local to basically every Bad Robot production, I think, so that the way that the scripts are distributed and they come electronically, and the crew tries to be extremely kind of assiduous about collecting sides, the pages that are being shot that day at the end of the day, and destroying them and all that sort of thing. But an interesting thing for us that actually is sort of a corollary thing that has to do with just the writing itself is that the funny thing about Stephen King and his library is that for the most part he's not really he's not a plot twist writer. You know what I mean? Like, so we think of secrets and twists, and JJ is famous for the kind of aesthetic of the mystery box. It's talked about all the time. That's sort of like the story is the puzzle, and that can be an incredibly pleasurable mode of storytelling for an audience, or frustrating at times, thrilling. But that's not really the kind of writer Stephen King is. And so it was one exercise that was really interesting for us in sitting down and trying to figure out how to tell this 10-hour story was balancing both the sort of expectations and the aesthetic that we associate with Bad Robot and J.J. Abrams, and also understanding. You think about The Shining. The end of the story is essentially spelled out pretty clearly, the sort of implications of what's going to happen. That this is a story about a guy, the last caretaker went crazy and killed his family. That's minute 8 of the movie. Do you know what I mean? And in the book, it's the same. So the experience of it is the experience of moving inexorably toward a horrific ending that is probably inevitable. And that's sort of what the aesthetic of the story is in a way. And so trying to figure out like how to zipper together those two different modes of storytelling was really interesting.
Well, the last thing I wanted to ask about before we get to the audience, because I'm sure you guys have some questions by now, is just kind of about Hulu. And first and foremost, why was Hulu such a great partner for you and a good spot to make the show? And then secondly, I've always believed that mysteries especially benefit from a weekly rollout. So the idea that there's going to be a lot of discussion about each and every episode about this show, which a lot of people are going to want to talk about for a lot of different reasons. I was curious if that played into your allure of going there, and then just your general thoughts on that idea of weekly releases versus binging it.
I can talk a little bit about Hulu, even though Hulu's sitting in the audience. I think one of the things that we truly were, I think, coming into this project, because it's, comes from these auspices, and we have this great canon of work to honor, and people have certain expectations when they come into a J.J. Abrams, Stephen King kind of project when they're, as a viewer. I know I would as a viewer. And I think one of the things that for us has been the most one of the most wonderful parts of the experience has been the extent to which Hulu and the creative executives at Hulu have not in any way tried to push us into a sort of box of commercialism or any of those things. And in fact, all of their notes and all of the feedback we've gotten has been about deepening character, about taking our time with things when it's necessary to take our time. And I think, and as a writer, that's like manna from heaven, so because inevitably we all know the sort of cliche of the network note that makes you, speed it up and make it bigger and make it louder and all those things, and obviously those things all have their place, and sometimes those notes are right too. But I think that for us, what was really important about this show was the idea from the beginning that Stephen King, part of the challenge of adapting Stephen King into a 2-hour movie is that inevitably part of what's great about Stephen King can get lost when you're trying to kind of ruthlessly cut it down to that number of minutes. An entire story, it's like a 1,000-page book cut into 2 hours. Like, what does that even mean? And I think part of what we always loved most about Stephen King was the character development, and that in a way, like, part of what he did, and what he's been doing all along is he reinvented a genre. He sort of told us, okay, a horror story can have these incredibly deep characters who we're connected to and we really feel for and feel like human beings that we know. And I think that was always when we set out, like, one of our initial goals was to do that kind of a Stephen King story. And so to be able to work with a bunch of executives who really were supportive of that and who wanted us to be able to lean into character and into human stories, that honestly has been the great gift, beyond the sort of exciting fact that we're at a network that is, on a streamer that released The Handmaid's Tale and all those things that have sort of happened actually since we started Castle Rock. At the same time, I think truly the best part has been the creative partnership.
Yeah, for sure. And then in terms of the other question, the question of like a weekly rollout or not, I will say that I, as a viewer, I like to be put on an IV drip. I like an episode a week. In a way, like I was saying this, maybe I was saying this to you last night. It's sort of like if every episode of Mad Men had been made available to me that first weekend, you would have just found my bones in the floor. I would have just like turned it on, and then there would have been like a body on the floor after like I would have burned through them all. Like I would have failed the marshmallow test. You know what I mean? I can't. I need someone to ration me.
Yeah.
But I think particularly for a show that has an element of kind of existential mystery that it runs its course through the season, I think it's really helpful to have some time to let the episodes breathe. And so to a certain extent, to be honest with you, that choice was a choice that was made above our pay grade, because Hulu does both of those things. There are shows that drop all episodes all at once, and then there are shows that don't. And our show, like Handmaids, I think that the plan is that the first 3 episodes are going to be made available all at the same time. Then the rest will be will go onto a weekly schedule. But we're really happy that they made that choice.
That's great, and I'm very excited as a critic to have the discussion every week, because it so far definitely feels like a show that warrants it, and we'll have people talking about, as I said, a lot of different things. And speaking of people talking other than me, I'm going to try to see past the light, and if people have questions, we're going to take them. I think I see a hand in the back there.
That's what we call fan service. You know what I mean? That was.
Well, and by the way, just so you guys know, you are the first people to have seen that hatch today. I mean, so yes, it was certainly something that was discussed.
Yeah, we discussed it. Yeah, I mean, if you have a hatch and you have Terry O'Quinn, you're going to send him down the hatch, right? You know what I mean? You're not going to not put him down in the hatch. Well, I mean, look, like, we love Lost so much, and love Damon Lindelof, and love Terry on that show, and so it was. We were just really excited when he said yes. I mean, he's somebody who, for me, I'm never not fascinated when I'm watching him. I don't know if you guys watch Patriot, but he's really fascinating on Patriot. He just has a face and a timbre of a voice and makes choices that moment to moment. There's this isn't spoiling anything, I don't think. I don't really know anymore. There's a scene at some point. He had a scene that is essentially like an 8-minute monologue, basically. And I remember looking at the dailies after they came in and thinking, like, don't even cut away. Just hang in this one shot. It never happens that you're like, I'm not bored for 8 minutes staring at this one shot. And it's just, that's something that Terry has, I think. So we were just psyched to get him.
Yeah, and you guys probably remember, I mean, obviously we're huge Lost fans, and one thing, in a roundabout way, the reason I think that that JJ and Stephen King really started to spend time together and talk was because Stephen King was writing these reviews of Lost in the back of Entertainment Weekly every week. And so, and he became obsessed with Lost himself, and I think, and there's all the sort of DNA of The Stand that is kind of woven through these seasons of Lost. And so I think that in a way, to whatever extent that feels like, I think we feel like that's homage in to whatever extent it exists.
All right. Do we have more questions? Yeah, right here in the front.
Welcome.
Oh wow!
scale.
Wait, was that like the? Are you paying honor to the leftovers because of?
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. It like leftovers is the place we go to cry, right? No. I'm with you. Yeah.
Can we have some more shows on the scale?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. We want the pain scale. Exactly.
One would be like Parks and Recreation, right? Like that's just pure joy, pure fun.
Yes.
And then like
Yeah. No. I hear you. Well, I mean, here's the thing that we talked about a lot. That I guess I'm not sure where to what numerical value I can give it. But but one thing we talked about a lot is that like horror, and this show is, I guess we'd call it psychological horror more than it's not a slasher in the woods show. And neither one of us has like an enormous appetite for viscera. Literally or metaphorically, but horror can do different things, right? There are horror movies that are sort of like big tentpole summer movies that are all about sort of like getting on a roller coaster, and they're actually hugely conventional, and the conventions are precisely what makes it fun. Like that you're gonna jump and scream here, and the extent to which it sort of like hits all the marks you expect it to is part of like and gives your limbic system a certain experience is like what you get out of it. Then there are other horror movies and stories that are uncomfortable because you don't know quite what to expect from them. And that's my experience of like watching. I still, like, if I flip past The Shining on TV, like I know that I just have to sit and finish it. But it's a profoundly, especially now that I have children, of my own, like it's a really, there's something queasy making and unsettling about entering into scenes and stories and not knowing exactly where they're headed, or what you should be afraid of and what you don't need to be afraid of. And that's which Stephen King does all the time. You know what I mean? Like, who else would say that like a Polaroid camera or a Plymouth Fury or, in that one Kindle single, a Kindle can be like an avatar of horror, But so I hope that this show makes people very uncomfortable at times. I guess this is a long way of saying that. We hope we make you uncomfortable.
that's the tagline. Yeah, right here.
Do you want to call out any successes and failures?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I think that the there are certainly some ways that you can categorize when I start to think about like the great Mount Rushmore of Stephen King adaptations, and you start thinking about Shawshank and Misery and The Shining and The Dead Zone and Stand By Me and Green Mile and some of the greats, and Carrie. I think that there's what's interesting is that even leaving aside the question of the filmmaking, there is such huge variation in those books in terms of what kinds of stories they are, and it sort of shows you what an incredibly big tent writer Stephen King is, which is to say, like, Shawshank is a small, totally natural story of friendship, and so is Stand By Me, and Misery is a crazy, comic, dark story about an obsessed woman, and then The Dead Zone and The Shining obviously have these like crazy supernatural elements to them, and so I think that it really, I mean, there is like it's hard to find the thread that sort of unites them all, except that I think that for us it goes back to that question a little bit, which is like, is there a beating heart at the center of the story? Is there, and that usually when you start to press down, and when I start to, obviously people have different tastes about what are the great Stephen King adaptations and what aren't, but when I think when we start to press down on it, usually it comes down to being able to connect to a character and being able to have the time to care about a relationship whether that is a toxic relationship like in Misery or in Carrie, or whether that is a loving relationship like between Red and Andy. You know, it's like, I think that it's that beating heart that makes all the difference in the world, if I had to sort of get at one thing. Whereas I think a lot of adaptations of lots of I think big, you know, horror and other very kind of commercial things, part of where they miss the mark is even when they have a great concept, there's no relationship or set of relationships to really anchor the viewer.
Yeah, and the only other thing I would say about that, because we tried to talk about this, or we tried to puzzle that out too a little bit, is that I don't know if this is going to make any sense, but I think that often the more successful adaptations, to the extent that they have a horror or a supernatural element, that element is presented and experienced subjectively through the point of view of the character, not presented objectively, right? There are horror movies that are all about like this sort of like video gamification of narrative. It's like, here's the big bad, here's the monster, what are the rules? You know, there's something that's actually kind of comforting about that storytelling, that mode, which says like, well, if you just figure out the rules, then you can kill the monster and order will be restored. That's generally not the way that for me, the more enduringly disturbing or interesting or emotionally trenchant Stephen King adaptations work. They're much more about confronting the unknown or the uncanny through the point of view of a character and going on a journey.
I think that made perfect sense. That was honestly very well put.
Thank you.
More questions? Right here, yeah.
Oh, oops. Yeah. Shit.
Well, just to start with the Dark Tower, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right that at some level, if you guys go and look at that, you know, that Stephen King map of the universe of Stephen King, that all the, you know, eventually all the beams connect to the Dark Tower in one way or another. You know, I think that for us, because we were really focused on the idea of this town, and because we were really focused on the idea of a place that had been kind of visited and revisited and beat down in a lot of different ways, that was sort of where we began. And so it truly, and I think that goes back to the email that Sam sent me 10 years ago, which is to say that for us, the Dark Tower is a sort of, it's like its own universe within the Stephen King universe, and even in terms of tone and in terms of approach, the Dark Tower in some ways is the wildest and most afar from some of the other kind of big Stephen King books. And so even though it's sort of at some level the center of the universe, it also feels like this kind of silo, and so we wanted to kind of take his sort of small town ethos and start with that, and kind of expand out from there. And then in terms of sort of where it can or does go, you know, I think we again take the sort of like think local approach to the first season, and feel that ultimately, of course, we're excited to be able to sort of expand out, but that we really wanted to keep our focus on this town at the beginning, and let the audience kind of settle into a place before we started to kind of metastasize.
Yeah, and I mean, one thing about that too is it's sort of like when you expand the horizons of a story and the genre of the story, it's sort of like once you go to the Dark Tower, you can't go back again. Yeah. Do you know? I don't know if that makes any kind of sense, but it's sort of like when the map gets larger, and so it's not to say that it can't ever happen, but we're, you know, we sort of built a story that starts out kind of weird and gets a little weirder with every episode, and we're sort of boiling the frog in that way, but it's not quite that weird yet.
All right, I think we've got time for one more if we've got a good one, and if not, I will try. But what do we got? Oh yeah, good, right over here.
I know we haven't even seen the first season yet, but you mentioned anthology. Will some of the characters still follow through, or is it going to be completely 100% separate in seasons to come?
There are some characters we'd love to see again or see more of in other contexts, but it won't be a traditional show in the sense that it's sort of like that we'll be following the same hero or heroes in a next season. And part of what was really cool to us and exciting about the idea of setting a show in this town, you sort of feel when Stephen King writes about these small towns that it's sort of like there's a story behind like every shuttered window, that it's sort of like he seems to have such a great command. There's like that great run in Salem's Lot where I don't know, it's like in like 7 pages he gives this sort of like little like thumbnail potted biography of like 17 different people who live in this town, and every one of them is this like wild story, and that feeling that it's sort of like the town's like a little advent calendar of stories and nightmares and disasters is really exciting to us. So being able to think about what would it be to tell a story in a second season that might be set in 1978 and be a different kind of Stephen King story, or might move into the future, or what being able to sort of honor the diversity of the kinds of stories that Stephen King tells, even as told about this one town, is sort of part of what was exciting to us.
Yeah, and I think too that we sort of take a Kingian approach to the return of characters in a way, which is that it's obviously very pleasurable. It was very pleasurable when Father Callahan turned up on the pages of The Dark Tower after being introduced to him, much earlier in Salem's Lot. And so I think, but that was a span of many years between those kind of connections. And I think that we like the idea of actually being able to come across characters and sort of catch back up with what they're doing at unexpected times, and sort of intersect with their stories in unexpected ways.
Well, I think everybody's going to look forward to seeing how that plays out in the future, as well as season 1. Thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for bringing the exclusive clip. And
Thank you
everybody,
guys.
Thank you
Thanks
too.
for watching.
July 25th, right? July 25th premiere date?
July 25th.
All right, let's get that out there. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.